Many people who have observed the past half-decade of American foreign policy have felt that the American consensus began with containment and its end was accommodation with the Soviet Union. And between those two great poles, American policy moved for 50 years. And of course, historical events overtook that vision of accommodation with the ending of the Soviet Union, the ending of a great Russian Empire, and the ending of the international communist movement. But we are still, in a sense, in a stage of accommodation with Russia, the other republics in the area, and with the impressive people who inhabit those republics. America's interest has been, and continues to be, I believe, accommodation and cooperation with those great states in making mutual commitments to a stable international order. The American people certainly wish the Russian people extraordinarily well in their efforts. We wish the entire nation well, and we have a particular disposition to support, of course, those people committed to reform and democracy. Our topic this evening is the Russian economy in transition, and it, of course, is really the story of an enormously talented people and a great nation at a critical point in their history. And to discuss this matter with us is Dr. Yegor Gaidar, an economist by profession and training, who all of you know has participated importantly in recent political events within Russia. He has served as the primary economic advisor to President Yeltsin. He's commonly seen as the architect of reform within Russia. He has held several key positions in government, including being acting prime minister for a period of time, and today heads the Russia's Choice Party, the largest reform party within the Duma, and occupies a critical position at the center, as I say, of this great historical period. It's with great anticipation as well as pleasure, and it is also my honor to introduce and present to you Dr. Yegor Gaidar.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, if there is most important lesson that we could draw from the history of the recent 3 or 4 years of the attempts to create the democracy, market economy, develop private sector on the basis of the previous socialist countries, that is the lesson that there is no easy way out of the socialism. The socialism really play in the human development a role that we could compare to the role of anabolic in sport. It helps to win the competition, but destroy the long-term health of the nation. So when all the instruments of the socialist control would start to function, the nation is being presented with an enormous task of the creation of the new market and democratic institutions in a very short period of time, because we just cannot wait decades and centuries that are usually needed to create a stable private property, the well-developed social structures, to accustom people to the democratic institutions, etc., etc. Well, to those who would disagree with me, I would put just one example. The history confronted with the task of transition from socialism to market economy, the country which had splendid opportunities to achieve this task. Of course, I mean the East Germany. The country that could immediately use the very stable West German currency. The country that immediately got well-developed West German legislation. The country that could use very efficient mechanism of the private sector in the Western Germany. And then the country that got the inflow of the capital of amount of approximately $100 billion per year to support the social programs. And all the same, it is the country in which the transition is very difficult, social pressures are serious, and political disturbances really treating. Well, more or less, it's evident why it's so difficult. It is an enormous change. Change of the habits, change of the institutions, change of the way of life. And in this change, somebody is winning and somebody is losing. And the society is winning in one aspect and losing in another. Well, if you are winning in this difficult transition, then of course, naturally, it's because you are clever, hardworking, lucky. You would not thank the government or the reforms for the wealth you are acquiring in the process of transition. Well, and if you are losing, of course it is not because you are lazy, drunkard, unqualified. It is of course because the economic policy, the government is very bad. So it is not the point on which we could complain. It's natural. The population, the people should not love its governments. But of course it creates very difficult political and social problems before the government that are trying to manage this transition. It was evident from the beginning that this transition in Russia would be especially difficult and painful. Well, first of all, in Russia we had not one generation, but 3 generations of the life without private property and without market. The experience of the market economy was absent in the public conscience. We had 0 level of private property and an existent private sector at the beginning of the reforms. We had enormous financial distortions, and then of course the level of military build-up of the military pressures connected with the previous Soviet economy were enormous, incomparable to any other country of the socialist regime. So it was more or less evident for us when we started the reform process in Russia. But even for us, there was a few very unpleasant surprises when we found ourselves in the position in the Russian government at the very end of the year 91. First of them was, of course, very dangerous and a very difficult situation with the food supply of the population. Well, in the year 90 and 91, practically all the communist system of the food distribution would stop to function. Previously, the state agriculture enterprises would not sell the agricultural products. Nobody would like to sell anything because nobody would need money. They would deliver agricultural products because they would be afraid of punishment by the state party officials, secret police, etc. Well, that system worked less and less smoothly at the end of the 80s, but after the August coup of the year 91, it just stopped to function. Nobody would be afraid anymore, and nobody would like to sell anymore. Yet, because nobody would like to have money. Money was nothing. We had at the time grain reserves that could last us approximately until January of the year 92. It was the moment when our hard currency reserves, destroyed by the latest communist government, could cover approximately 1 day of our import. They were very close to zero. Russia would not be in a position to service its debt it inherited from the Soviet Union, so possibilities of getting the loans to cover the needs would be very limited. The first situation in which I would be confronted when I was nominated Deputy Prime Minister was the long line of the governors of the Russian regions and the mayors of the biggest Russian cities waiting in the doors of my office, asking me somehow to deliver the food, because they have grain for 2 days, they have grain for 3 days, etc. So they would ask me somehow to deliver it, or probably to extract what is left from the military reserves prepared for the event of the war. I do remember very well how, for instance, in the St. Petersburg region, we decided to use the latest possible military reserves that was left in the January of the year 92. Russia then was really at the bank of the serious humanitarian catastrophe with the unpredictable social and political consequences. It was also the part of reality, and those who lived in Russia during the end of the year 91 do remember very well these feelings, this danger, this hysterical situation when everybody would try to send their relatives to the countryside to somehow survive during this period of time. That was the starting point of the Russian reforms, and not some splendid, calm situation in which we could move gradually and smoothly and to plan for the decades, etc. We had practically two choices. Either immediately to introduce martial law and to try by force to extract once again the food from the countryside. Exactly what the Bolsheviks have done during the year 1718, starting the civil war. Probably with a similar consequence. Or we had immediately, without any preparation, with a country where the institutions necessary to manage normally the market economy were non-existent, to start the market and somehow make it work. Well, I would not, of course, try to explain and to tell the sad story of how we try to deal with all of this problem, but now it is time to get a summary of the results that we're able and unable to achieve during this very difficult transition, when any movement in the economic policy were the subject of a fierce confrontation in the different political forces in Russia. Well, first of all, now it is evident that there is no more problems of the food supply in Russia, no more problems of the hunger, no more problems of the rationing of the food products, etc. The markets are, of course, not perfect, but they do work. You can now buy in average Russian city 1,000 kilometers from Moscow, more or less everything you can buy in Moscow. And in Moscow you can buy, of course, not as many goods as you can buy in Baltimore, but the difference is not striking anymore. The most pressing problem that vast majority of the Russians would think absolutely unresolvable, problem of the shortage economy, is efficiently resolved in the country. You do not anymore need to wait for 3 to 4 hours in line to buy 2 kilograms of bad salami. You do not need to wait an hour in line to buy bread. You do not have to travel to Moscow 1,000 kilometers to try to buy meat for your family, etc. All of it is in the past. The second thing that was done during this period of time was the creation of the private sector in Russia. Of course, we had a very well understanding that in a 2-year period of time, you cannot create the efficient mechanism of the ownership control, well-developed system of the corporate governance, that the rapid privatization will not immediately change the attitudes of the enterprises, will not immediately increase the level of efficiency. If we would think about such possibilities, we just would not understand anything about the realities of economy. But all the same, if we would, from another point of view, try to deal with our privatization as many West European countries have done, trying to restructure enterprise by enterprise, trying to deal with each case individually, we would be privatizing Russian economy well into the 23rd and 24th century. So that's why we had to apply universal procedures. That's why we had to create the social coalition that would support privatization, otherwise around we just would not do nothing from above. That's why we created additional demand for the privatized property in the form of privatization checks. Well, that created the possibility to change rather drastically distribution of the property. And the most important fact from my point of view is by itself the fact that property now is distributed. Well, more than 70% of our service sector, of the retail trade, is in the private hands. 15,000 of the 19,000 biggest Russian enterprises are converted to the joint stock companies, and their share are tradable in the market. It does not immediately create enormous amount of change, but to those, for instance, who had a chance to walk by the streets of Moscow, St. Petersburg 3 years ago, and ultimately the striking difference that is connected with the privatization of the previously state shops is more or less evident. So not immediately, not in a few weeks, but the privatization really opens the way for the initiative and innovation. When we try to explain that we will make the ruble convertible currency, usually we would be laughed off. Nobody would believe that it is possible. Now, ruble, of course, is very unstable yet, but freely convertible currency. There is no legal or practical problems on the way of conversion of it legally. You can do it in any street of any Russian city, and very rapidly the vast majority of the population understood the possibilities. For instance, now it is not the too splendid experience because it is closely connected with our financial instability, but now Russian populations buy something like $1.5 billion per month in its savings, as our budgetary investigations show to us. The average wage in dollar terms that was approximately $7 per month at the end of the year 91 now is around $100 per month. Of course, it's very low. And of course, you should not think that it practically increased 10 times, that the real well-being increased 10 times, but it shows that the level of opening of the economy and financial stabilization changed rather drastically in the comparison with the end of the year 91. Well, what were the problems which were especially difficult for us, and the directions in which we could not achieve the serious results? Of the payments we had to do for the start of the economical transformation, usually, first of all, is being mentioned the problem of the downfall of the production. It is real and it's rather serious, but I would not think that it is most serious problem with which now Russia is confronted. First of all, any Russian, especially any Russian manager, knows very well that at least 20% of the production that existed in the Soviet Union statistical data existed only in the paper. Previously, the report about the overfulfillment of the plan was the splendid precondition for the promotion, for the increased pay, or for the governmental medal. Now it is a precondition for additional visit of the tax collector. So, of course, it rather seriously changed the stimulus. But another factor is, of course, the more important, and that is the role of the military industry in the Russian economy. When we are discussing the problems of the downfall of the production, we as if forgetting what really the military sector meant for the Russian economy. It was not one of the branches of the economy, as for instance in the United States. It was the essence of the economy. It practically was the Russian economy, and all the rest branches of the economy were subservient to this sector. Soviet military and the foreign policy strategy was based on the precondition that we should be in a position to lead war against all of another countries together, against the United States, against Western Europe, against China, against Japan. And it would not then surprise you that we, at the end of the year 80s, were producing more conventional weapons, not than any of the another countries of the world, but more than all of another countries of the world together. For instance, it applied to the tanks, to the guns, to the many kinds of the military equipment. And of course, when we drastically cut down the military purchases in the year 92 on the many types of the equipment in 30 to 40 times, of course it created enormous pressure not only on the military sector itself, but all of the Russian economy. Well, for instance, you would not understand what happened in the world aluminium market during the latest 4 years if you would forget the amount of aluminium that was usually consumed in the Russian military sector and is not consumed anymore. You would not understand, for instance, why the world price for nickel fell down from $70,000 per ton that it was at the end of the 80s to $5,000 per ton now, if you will forget how much nickel was consumed by the Russian military production. And that is in many other branches of economy. The best chemistry worked for the military uses, best ferrous metallurgy worked for the military purposes, etc., etc., etc. And of course, all of these industries were confronted with enormous and immediate problems of the demand for their products. Well, by itself, I think it is not, it is of course the pressure, and of course it is a problem, but it's also enormous potential. For instance, for the years we tried to pursue, not we then, the Soviet government still, tried to pursue our military sector that it should, for instance, produce oil and gas equipment or spare parts for the automobiles. Well, the answer was usual, well, you need it. Well, provide us money, hard currency, equipment, space, personnel, then we will do something. In the year 92, we had a chance to see a very unusual picture of the directors of the big military enterprises running around asking who would deliver to us the orders for some civil goods. And that, of course, created the real stimulus for the conversion of the military industry. The problem that was probably most important and most pressing is closely connected with the reforms was the increase of the level of the income inequality. Of course, the social inequality was not at all unknown under the communist regime. It was very, very clear. It was very, very clear. And of course, it created enormous pressure not only on the military sector itself, but all of the rest branches of the economy. You would not understand what happened in the world aluminium market during the latest 4 years if you would forget the amount of aluminium that was usually consumed in the Russian military sector and is not consumed anymore. You would not understand, for instance, why the world price for nickel fell down from $70,000 per ton that it was at the end of the 80s to $5,000 per ton now, if you will forget how much nickel was consumed by the Russian military production. Also, those who lived in the Soviet Union were very well aware that there was a lot of goods reserved for those in the high ranks of nomenclature. For instance, everybody would know that this type of the salami would not be bought in the shop for any money, for an indefinite amount of money. It is reserved for those who have a position to go to the special closed shops. That there are shops, some types of the chocolates, for instance, which would not be never in the free sale for money. They would be reserved for the, for instance, the top bureaucrats from the chief of the department of the ministry and higher, etc., etc. And well, the situation existed for the decades, and the society get accustomed to it more or less. Well, it doesn't surprise anybody. But if something is in the shop, then of course it's for everybody. It's as if it's free. Well, then now you have a reverse situation. Everything is in the shops. There is no restricted distribution. Everybody could buy it. There is, for instance, the splendid shoes in the shops. You don't need to be the minister to buy them. The only fact that is important to have money. And then you cannot buy shoes that are in the shop just because you do not have money. It is an enormous new experience. It is insulting in some way. Also, of course, the level of the income inequality in the period of the very difficult transition, in the period when the markets are inefficient, in the period when the possibilities of the rent seeking are huge, where the role of the state is still excessive, the amount of the corruption is high, are quite impressive. Inflation is high, and income differentiation usually goes along with the high inflation. Also, you have to have in mind that the economy is not growing. And then you have a very unpleasant combination of a stagnant economy and increasing income inequality. The situation in which the lower strata of the middle class are being confronted with the perspective of pauperization. And of course, it creates enormous potential for the destructive propaganda, for the pro-totalitarian, pro-communist, pro-nationalist propaganda. Well, it is evident that there is only one way, at least in the framework of the market and democracy, of dealing with the problem. And that's very simple. This way is very simple. Create a precondition under which the economy will start growing. And then, on the basis of the economic growth, accumulate the financial resources that will allow you to resolve the most pressing social problems. There's no other way in the framework of the market and democracy. And that is more or less evident what you have to do to create this precondition. Create a stable property relationships, stable currency, cut down the state expenditures, cut down the amount of the taxation, make taxes not unprohibitive, and then you will have the economic growth based on the private savings and the private investments. There is no other way out of this situation. The problem is that, of course, crucial precondition for this growth is the very serious reform of the state that we inherited from the Soviet Union. Most pressing, most serious problems of Russian economy now are connected with the Russian state. From the problem of corruption, the problem of inflation. If you need any additional argument for the fact that corruption usually is closely connected with the excessive state regulation, you should use the Russian experience, latest Russian experience, to prove this very well-known fact. When and if you are trying, for instance, to regulate the foreign trade with the quota and the license mechanism. And state employee would sign the paper which will increase the value of your product 10 times, then you will not find the thousand of terribly honest state employees that would never take a bribe. If you have a system of redistribution of the subsidized credits that could enrich enterprise or the person in 1 minute, then of course it is an enormous stimulus for corruption. And the essence of the political debate now in Russia is exactly connected with the point of the Russian state. Our differences with the present government are very simple. Well, the government is trying to promote reforms in a few fields that I think are important, including privatization and generally the path of financial policy. But it has a general idea that the source of the most pressing Russian problems is that we do not have enough of the state regulation, that we should have the bigger state expenditure, bigger amount of the state employees, bigger powers in the hands of the state employees. And that is represented in the budget that was submitted to Duma, to the Russian parliament recently. For the first time in a 3-year, government proposed quite serious increase of the share of the government expenditure in the GDP, which we tried to cut down during the previous period of time. This article, the expenditures that are increasing more rapid than any others, not are the health care expenditures or the education expenditure, they are expenditure for the state machinery. I think that this strategy will never resolve Russian problems. You cannot extract additional tax revenues from the Russian economy. The level of taxation is excessive already. Any attempts to increase it further will lead only to one result, to the increase of the illegal economy and to the tax avoidance. And if you cannot cover it by the usual taxation, then of course you will cover them by the money creation, so that will restore the monetary stability forever. And you will not have the serious private investment with the interest rate that are 17% per month. So practically this path goes nowhere. You will not, without the private investment, you will not have the economic growth. Without economic growth, you will never resolve the pressing social problems. So that means that the alternative is very simple. Either on the basis of the dissatisfaction with the inequality, trying to use this dissatisfaction, the destructive forces, the coalitions of the old communists and the radical nationalists will have a chance to grab power and to destroy the democratic institutions in Russia, or we will be able to create a strong enough political coalition to promote the economic reforms necessary to open the door for the market-oriented development. That is the essence of the political struggle today. Well, dear friends, once again I will tell you, there is no easy way of socialism. But it is not the basis for the panic. It is just the point we will have in mind and the point that should make us especially efficient, especially hardworking in our fight, in our attempt to create the basis for the stable, pro-market, private and democratic development in Russia. Thank you.
Granted that the Russian economic problems are dismal, what prospect did you have for forcing people to deal with difficult economic problems by your program of shock therapy?
Defend shock therapy.
Well, it is a rather difficult problem for me because I had no chance to see this film and only the latest 10 minutes. So it is very difficult for me to argue with the concept of the film I had not seen. But on the point of the shock therapy, well, first of all, there was never any shock therapy in Russia. Shock therapy is more or less technical term, and it's connected with the drastic cuts in the rates of the money supply to curb the inflation. In Russia, we had very radical reforms, including the liberalization, the opening of the economy, radical institutional reform, banking reform, the tax reforms, privatization, etc., etc. But we never had anything like shock treatment because the monetary policy in Russia, due to the many reasons I would not like to enter, was very weak all of the previous 3 years. And I am absolutely sure that one of the most important reasons for the present Russian economic problems was exactly this, that the monetary policy was too loose for the sake of the Russian stabilization. So first of all, there was never any shock treatment. The second point, which is usually meant when we are discussing the problems of the radical or gradual approach, is the idea that the gradual approach would produce less painful social results. Well, it is the point which is very difficult to argue in the general terms without applying the experience we now have of the 23 countries, independent countries, which are trying to go from socialism to market in the West Europe and the previous Soviet Union. So it's easier when we are not trying to make some theoretical constructions, but are in the detail trying to analyze which economic policy led to the what results. And the experience we can analyze shows very clearly that the attempts to slow down the transition, to make it gradually, to preserve, for instance, the state orders, price controls, to make the privatization slow, to make the monetary policy loose, etc., are producing the disastrous results. Well, you can go to Moscow from two directions. You can go to Moscow from Baltimore, and you will see a lot of the problems. You can go to Moscow from Kiev, and you will think that the Moscow is the paradise. And that is exactly the country that is very close to Russia and in which this program of the gradual approach was applied during the last 2.5 years. So I don't think that exactly because the problems of transition are difficult by themselves, that's why we should be especially aggressive. That's why we should be especially trying to make this transition rapid and to create as rapidly as we can the precondition for the economic stabilization, economic growth.
Yes, at the microphone.
Your candor today is remarkable and appreciated. Perhaps you can extend it to two questions that I have. One, to what extent can Russia anticipate being an exporter of oil and gold, which would produce currency that they need? That's question one. Question two, how would you respond to someone from the United States who wants to invest in Russia and is terrified of Zhuravsky?
Well, on the first problem of the export of oil, the point that is usually not understood even by the experts in the oil sector is that we are now facing enormous oversupply of the oil in our internal market. The point is that the Soviet Union consumed inefficiently enormous amount of oil. And now, when the market mechanism, even unstable, under place, it is evident that it's impossible to sell for money, not for free, but for money, even the smaller amount of oil in Russia. We are facing now enormous problems of the demand for our oil and oil products because of the economic crisis on the Ukraine, which would not pay for our oil, because of the economic restructuring in the country, etc. So even with the quite serious decline of the production, now the supply of oil is much higher than the demand for it. And the most pressing problem in Russia is not where to get oil, but what to do with the oil. So that's why we are exporting now as many oil as we could transport. The only important factor is the factor of transportation. We are connected with the markets that are limited and closed by our pipelines, like Hungarian markets, Czech market, Slovakian market, Polish market. We are connected by the pipeline with the Yugoslavian market on which we could not work because of the sanctions. We are constrained by the possibilities of our major oil terminal in Novorossiysk seaport, which could not export more than 30 million tons of oil per year, etc. So we are now exporting as many oil as we can transport and sell on the international market. And this situation will prevail in the future if, of course, the oil export will be profitable from Russia, competitive, and if the oil price will not be too low. As with the gold, the similar situation. The gold production in Russia is stable now. It even increased in the year 93 in the comparison with the year 92. And the demand for oil, which was used previously in a quite substantial degree in the military industry, had fallen down. So that created possibilities for us to start restoring our gold reserves that were destroyed by the communists, and to create, of course not as important as the oil, but substantial export potential. So that was the points of the gold and oil. As to the Zhirinovsky, I think I could answer this way. If anybody, and probably it should be God Almighty, would ensure that Russia will be a stable country during next decade, I am sure that enormous line of the American businessmen would be standing in Moscow to start business there because of the opportunities. So now, of course, it's risk investment. There is a political risk. And I would not like to deceive you that there is no political risk. But also the rates of return are rather unusual. Russia is one of the few places in the world when the rates of return are usually measured not in the percentage points, but in the times per year.
My question, Mr. Gaidar, is the young people in Russia seem to be fairly resilient as far as adapting to the transition. My concern is what is going to happen to people in their 40s and 50s who are losing their jobs as a result of the loss of the military production and the consequent demoralization that's occurring in the country.
Well, it is, of course, one of the key problems, and that's, for instance, a very serious problem for us. The support for the pro-reform policy goes from the highly educated, highly qualified, urban, and the younger population. The opposition to reform from the poorly educated, low qualified, and older, and the country population. And that was very evident in all of the political confrontations of the previous 2 years. Well, of course, the natural instruments that should be used is the unemployment benefits, retraining of the unemployed, restructuring of the inefficient industries, and the resolution of the most pressing social problems. But I'm absolutely sure that all of this very serious problem is absolutely impossible to resolve by keeping inefficient industries going, by the high subsidies from the state budget. Well, for instance, we are now spending on the subsidies to the coal industry enormous amount of money, approximately 1/2 of our income tax. And 90% of this money goes to the 30% of the coal mines that are producing 10% of our coal. Well, it's evident that you have to invest in the retraining, in the social problem, when it's necessary in resettling of the miners. But to continue this situation is ridiculous.
Yes, sir, at the microphone.
Dr. Gaidar, I know that you are not responsible for the decisions of the present Russian government. But my question is to you anyway, why does the Russian government insist that the two Baltic states, Estonia and Latvia, who were devastated for 50 years by Soviet-Russian occupation, now pay for the building of Russian military housing in Russia before they pull out their occupation troops out of these formerly, presently independent countries? And why even build military housing anyway? Why not send these people home and let them join the private economy?
Well, it is not as simple as this, of course, because to send them home, you have to provide home for them. They are the officers. They do not have any home in Russia. We are not really, we never strongly insisted on the financing of the constructions of the homes for the officers by Baltic states. It was the points that were used once or twice in the budgeting process, but we do not hope seriously that they would provide these resources. For instance, Lithuania, with which we had an agreement about the withdrawal of the forces, paid nothing, of course, for the resettlement of the Russian officers, but of course it is a pressing problem. The most serious problem in our negotiations with Latvia and Estonia, of course, is not the payment for the resettlement of the officers, but the very well-known problems of the human rights of Russian-speaking population in these republics. And that, of course, very serious problem, both external and internal, for the Russian politics.
Now, all commissions from the European Union and from American Senate have been down there looking into the human rights situation, find that all the human rights are being respected and have never been able to prove anything to the contrary. It's strange that the country that has really violated the human rights of the Baltic people now talks about human rights.
Well, I could only tell that I'm representing the political forces in Russia which have done a lot to ensure the independence of the Baltic states. Probably you do understand that if you would not crush the attempted coup in the August of the year 91, there would no independent Baltic states. We were going before the tanks in the year 91 to defend the independence of Baltic states after the January 91 events in Lithuania. And all the time we were cooperating very smoothly with our colleagues, with our friends of democratic movements in the Baltic states in this process. And all the time we were assured in this process that never you will have any problems with the human rights of the Russian population in these Baltic states. Never there will be the problems with the citizenships, never there will be the problems with the property, etc. That was the part of the political reality of the year 91. And it is rather difficult for us to understand how our friends so rapidly have forgotten our telephone numbers after this independence was assured.
In connection with your last question on encouraging foreign business into Russia, and your discussion of the Duma, can you describe some of your strategies to get through laws or make coalitions that will support privatization once the voucher system has ended this summer, to continue it? Thank you.
Well, of course, now from the 1st of July, we are facing quite another situation that the situation that existed in Russia at the start of the privatization, when we had a zero private sector. We have a big private sector, we have working markets, we have unstable, poorly developed, but existing security markets, etc. So now you do not need anymore to create additional demand for the property. It could be presented by the private sector and including the foreign investors. So now our idea is that we should closely connect the privatization with the recapitalization of the private enterprises, privatizing enterprises. So if you would like to have an additional investments, then the best way for you is to go to the investment tender, in which the money that will be earned by the state in this tender would be directed for the increase of the efficiency of your enterprise. So that creates the stimulus for the enterprises. The part of the revenues that will be accumulated from the privatization, especially in those enterprises that should be privatized previously, would go into the local budgets. So that's why we will create the possibilities for the we will create a stimulus for the local authorities to participate in the privatization process. And then probably the part of the money we will use in the special fund to compensate at least part of the losses of the populations that were connected with the savings on the moment of the beginning of the reform, that of course were strongly suffered. It will be privatization for money, not for privatization checks. It will be slower, of course, privatization than before. We are prepared to negotiate the concrete mechanism of this privatization. We do understand very well that there is no optimal economical solution in privatization. There are only socially acceptable solutions.
We have time for only 2 more questions. The gentleman at this microphone and the first gentleman at that microphone. Make your questions as brief as possible.
The fact that Russia is still in default on much of its debt is also another issue that prevents foreign investment. How important is resolving that in your eyes, and is there opposition in Parliament to resolving the debt situation and possibly opposition towards foreign investment in general?
Well, there is no opposition toward the problem of the Soviet debt, because you could not, there is not the subject for which you will have the opposition. There is a very pressing financial problems connected with the servicing of the Soviet debt we inherited from the Soviet Union. They should be dealt on in the framework of the Paris and the London Club negotiations. And generally, I think we are having an understanding with our partners in these negotiations. As to the foreign investment, of course, there is a very serious opposition in the Russian parliament to all the foreign investments. There is a strong forces in Russia which would like to return the country to the path of the isolationism, xenophobia, which would like once again to close the economy, and which would be terribly unhappy with any successful investment projects with the foreign participation. But it is the part of the Russian political life and the Russian political struggle.
Our last question.
Sir, I would just like to firstly pay my respects to you, sir, for going through what you have been and being able to be with us here today. Knowing Russia the way I do, you must be a very charismatic and very strong individual. Secondly, that I personally, 5 years ago, met a Russian economist who came to this country, and I believe that he is personally known to you. And because of my relationship and respect for this human being, I personally went ahead and invested, which to me is a substantial amount of money. I own a company, a joint stock company in Russia, and I own a US company. And my question relates, and it's also some basic comments and experience of what I've been through, but my question really at the end relates to the mafia and the existing corruption that is going on inside that country. I have chosen to keep my company outside the existing system. I choose not to be part of the problem as such. I choose to be part of the solution, I hope. But in that context, what transpires to my employees and those around me inside Russia and the pressure that is upon them as it relates to the mafia is quite horrendous, and it's something that I cannot personally relate to. And it is very definitely stopping myself and I know others from further investment in Russia. That same concept of the mafia, if I can digress a little further, to me is also at the basis of the way in which in this country we look at contracts. In other words, legally binding infrastructure. Yet in Russia, you're looking at relationships between individuals. That contracts and the infrastructure, to me, are the very basis of what Russia needs. More than money, more than anything, it's the infrastructure. And I've overstayed my few words I had to say, but address what you can. Thank you, sir.
Well, thank you. It is not really the question. I could not agree with you more. Of course, the contractual law is one of the most important points for the progress of the Russian economy. And of course, the problems connected with the organized crime are also, with the crime generally, are also a very pressing social problem. If you would ask, for instance, me to name one single problem that probably influenced more than any on the outcome of the elections in the December of the year 93, I would name not an economical problem, but a crime. And that's also is the part of the story of the Soviet and the post-socialist transition. Well, I do not think that in this room we will find a single person who will cry about the fate of the previous KGB. But all the same, you have to understand the role of the KGB in the previous Soviet society. The KGB was the institution that had an agent in any classroom, in any college group, in any small working collective. And of course, first of all, it was used for the political control and for the political oppression, but also, if necessary, to fight against the organized crime, against, for instance, to investigate murders, drugs, etc. And they were quite efficient. Really, for instance, the matters connected with the murder usually were discovered by the KGB mechanism and then only then transferred to the police. So now we do not have this mechanism, we do not have any secret police, we do not have the closed borders, we do not have the administrative control over the movement of the population, and of course our police institutions are not adapted yet to this situation. We need time and money to make them adapt.
Mr. Gaidar, we appreciate very much your informing us this evening, and we certainly appreciate enormously what you represent in terms of the enormous energies and intelligence which you're devoting to that very noble effort to found a decent regime within your country. It's been a great privilege for us to be here and a marvelous evening. We thank you.